All right. So we are a minute after, and we are going to go ahead and start the next session. Now, we have one more panelist who still needs to bump in because, as an amateur, what I did, I sent him the message and I put 11 a.m. Eastern, and I shouldn't have done that. So he popped in at 8 a.m., but then I realized, okay, he and I live like 10 minutes from each other. I should have known to say Pacific for him. So Mr. Mark Coxon will probably jump on in a second, and we'll push him in when it becomes time. So this is the one. I know I keep saying it, and we said it earlier, and BC and I talked about it for accessibility and universal design. I will say really quickly, this is an awesome panel, one that I'm just going to sit back and learn, because when I had both Josh and Jim on the podcast before, I was just floored. Two of my favorite podcast episodes ever, because it made me really think more about the way we should design our classrooms and the way we service our customers, to really think about everyone and everyone's right to that education and ways we can do that. So with no further ado, this one is being moderated by our two steering committee members, Josh Kaufman at Tufts, and again, Jim Wellings, who's doing a twofer here off the last one from Utah State. So guys, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you, and I'm going to click myself off. And again, this is accessibility and universal design, our third of 3 for today.
Hi, everyone. I see Mark Coxon just jumped in as well. So welcome to him, Mark. I'm Josh Kaufman. I'm from Tufts University here in Medford, Massachusetts. Here with Jim Wellings over in Utah. Jim, if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, Jim Wellings, Utah State University, the system designer and programmer here at Utah State.
Fantastic. So our panel here, we have obviously Mark Coxon, who just jumped in, Valerie Haven, I know from University of Massachusetts, and Cynthia Wiley from Iowa, I believe. If you guys want to just introduce yourself real quick. You guys, you just have to turn on your mics.
Hi, I'm Cindy Wiley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Cindy Wiley from Iowa State University. I'm the digital accessibility coordinator here.
Fantastic. Mark, your audio wasn't working earlier. Are you back on?
All right, hold on. All right, so Mark, we have no audio, and then Valerie, you are muted. I am attempting to unmute you remotely, but it is not letting me.
I think I fixed my audio.
All right, there we go. Mark, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I am Mark Coxon. I am the sales director at Tangram Interiors. So I run the sales, the technology department here at a company that does traditional kind of education and workplace furniture and design.
And then Valerie, it looks like we're unmuted now. So there we go. But we have no audio.
How about now?
There we go.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Hi, I'm Valerie Haven. I just retired from the University of Massachusetts, where I still teach a graduate course in universal design for access and instruction for the instructional design graduate program. I also do a lot of consulting and research in issues of disability access.
Fantastic. Jim, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So I know I'm interested in this session because I'm actually pretty new to the universal design and accessibility. It's kind of surprising that I'm on this panel, but we actually did a project here that I like to tell people that we accidentally made a room accessible. And we thought that was really cool. We figured out that's what we've done. So we had a project. We incorporated Alexa control of a classroom system going through, and what we use here is Crestron. So we took a Crestron system and allowed Alexa to control it. So thereby making the system voice accessible for the instructors. And we actually had an instructor here in our English department who's visually impaired. And our accessibility office found out that we'd done this as an experiment. And they said, hey, we have an instructor who can use this. Can we deploy this? And to us, this was an experiment we had just done. We had maybe had it working for a week. And we said, sure. Just assuming we weren't going to have any issues. We said, sure, we'll deploy it and see how it works. And it actually worked really well. She was happy with it. And we've since expanded the system, made it easier to deploy. Essentially now we can deploy it to any generally scheduled classroom on request. It really only takes a couple of hours to apply the code and do the installation. So it was kind of fun. And since then, we've actually been talking about a lot of other accessibility issues. And I know on the description for this and some of the chat they had this morning, Joe Way and the others were talking about some other ways to make classrooms accessible. One of them would be assisted listening. And we have assisted listening over Wi-Fi, which actually turned out to be a fairly successful experiment as well. So we're looking at ways to expand that.
And here at Tufts, I'm also focused heavily on universal design, universal accessibility in the classroom. One area in which I've been doing that has actually been with using auto captioning and trying to push for that more. As more and more products have rolled out automatic captioning and automatic translation for live speakers using AI, I've found that actually, ironically, starting with HR, with onboardings for different departments, it actually really has come in incredibly handy to be able to say, look, we can set this up with a quick package routing the audio into it so that people are able to not only just see the translation, the captions live in the room, but they're also able to see a translation perhaps in their native language, which is an area that is not necessarily disability related in terms of accessibility, but it is in terms of they've come here to work, they're here being onboarded as staff, there is information they need to have, and we can't necessarily provide a translator for every single individual or take into account, a live human translator, but we can, through AI, provide them a translation of that information that they need. So at the beginning of the semester, we actually managed to roll that out to a couple of departments that were doing their onboarding and get that moving as well. And slowly but surely, I'm starting to get more people to look at, hey, maybe we can implement this in this event. Maybe this instructor who's teaching in multiple locations and the audio, there's concern about audio or whatever else, that's starting to pick up.
So I know a lot of emphasis is on accommodating students, and we've all done that for years and years, figured out ways to accommodate the learners. I think accommodating faculty maybe wasn't on our radar before we actually had this request that I mentioned. I think that's a really important thing to consider. And it seems like it's worked out pretty well for us. I just thought I'd throw that in.
It's interesting you mentioned accommodating faculty, actually, Jim, because one of the things that another school that I was working at, they did ask repeatedly, we got a request, can we put Braille on a touch panel? And of course, that's one area where we've raced ahead. We've said we want touch panels in these rooms because that's the new thing that Crestron and Extern are putting out. But you can't put Braille. You can't put a strip with a touch reactive thing or touch thing on that display. And so then we have to go back and look at, for example, as you did, how do we make this now accessible?
We actually found, with the Alexa project, we found that we've actually made at least one of our classrooms easier to use for even faculty who don't need the assistance. So we have an active learning space, which has 13 student pods and an instructor pod. We have a touch panel designed for that I did. It's actually very complex, as you can imagine, when you have to choose on a touch panel, how am I going to choose who's shown to the room, or if one pod shares with another. I've got to look at this panel and understand a complicated set of visual controls. Can I make it easier to use? And it actually turns out that with Alexa, we were able to do that because you just make a voice request, Alexa share pod A, that will share pod A to the room. And various things like that actually bypass several layers of menus. And for those people that aren't comfortable with using a touch panel or trying to understand complex controls and they're in a hurry, I think this really helps. So it not only helps the people that have visual impairment possibly, but it helps just all the users of the room. I'll bet Mark has some insight on on universal design as far as that goes as well. I mean, this is all good stuff to help everyone, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting space for sure, and we have a lot of education clients here at our facility. In fact, we have our own academy here where we run an academy here where we do a lot of in-house training. And like what you said with the visual controls, you know, they can work well, but for some people they aren't that intuitive, right? Depending on what you have. And what we really try to focus on in our space, obviously we have to worry about accessibility from a physical standpoint, like how do we get in the room, how do we maintain distance between walls and furniture, and how do we create access to, you know, an interactive display that's on the wall that may need to move down to an ADA compliant height, you know, those type of things. But also just accessibility of data and things in general. Some interesting pieces I've seen out in the space lately for some of this, you know, we were talking about this translation piece. I don't know if everybody's saw the Williams Sound convey piece that they showed at Infocom last year. It wasn't up and running because Wi-Fi in the convention center was terrible. I saw it work in there. But it's really just leveraging Google Translate. You know, so we're starting to see devices that come out on the market that are made for kind of our education and corporate environments that are utilizing these AI engines that already exist. And so that device will actually live translate up to 17 different languages, you know, just by speaking the microphone, and actually create those captions in a different language as well if you want to do captioning in a separate language that's out there. I've also seen this with one of the companies I used to work for here in the area is a company called Mad Systems, and they do a lot of museums. We can imagine museums have a lot of the same accessibility issues and compliance issues as a public space that a university would. And so a lot of that for canned content like digital signage or wayfinding or some of those things, they actually just, I think, were granted a patent on their AI facial recognition system. But it can be facial recognition or it can be pattern recognition. So you could wear, if you're wearing a green hat or if you have a badge with a triangle, maybe that's what you're tracking instead of the face. So if you have privacy issues, you can kind of, or concerns, you can mitigate those by using something besides the physical face geometry. But one of the things I saw in their shop, you know, I walked up to a display. The display is giving some information to whoever comes up to the system. And it knows that based on my profile that I speak English, so the audio is in English. Maris, who owns the company, is from Holland. As he walks up and stands beside me, the second camera comes up and the audio continues in English, subtitles pop up at that. So it's serving us both. It's serving me English audio and it's serving him Dutch subtitles. And if I left, the audio would switch over to Dutch completely and the subtitles would disappear. So we're starting to see, we've reached a point technologically where we're able to start to solve a lot of problems that we couldn't before, or that we had really complex, I guess, solutions for in a very easy way, depending on how we want to do them. And I think the other thing that we've really seen a change on in accessibility is just, you know, from kind of an ADA compliance standpoint, number one, creating ways of access through cameras or through distance learning. Obviously, that's another way to create access. If you can't create physical access, you can create virtual access. And then the other piece that we've been seeing actually help out a lot are OLED. So just because the displays become thinner and thinner, and now your envelopes for protruding edge and all those things in spaces become easier to adhere to because you don't have, you know, 3-inch thick displays on a 1-inch mount. You have a 4mm thick display on a magnet and it sticks to the wall. So I think we're starting to see more and more innovation that helps us solve these problems, which is fun.
I know in the last session there was and this kind of relates a little bit to what you're just saying with display sizes and footprint. We were talking about AV over IP, and the footprint for all this equipment is much smaller than it used to be. And one of the things that's allowed us to do, if I go back to our active learning space, our instructor consoles used to have a big rack of equipment under the instructor console, a huge, I mean, a physically imposing piece of hardware. It's difficult to make that console accessible to allow it to, say, raise and lower, or allow a piece that's at a lower level for someone who's in a wheelchair or someone who can't stand at the console to reach. One of the things we've been able to do is now we take a standard office table, a sit-stand desk, and everyone's seen these. I mean, they're great for offices, but the equipment footprint is so small that we can use a sit-stand desk and have a continuously adjustable height on the instructor console. There's just a couple of small pieces of equipment bolted to the other side of it. And that equipment can actually ride up and down with the desk when you adjust the height. So that is now our standard console. It's something we're building in-house. We have no need for the huge equipment rack anymore. And any console we build is infinitely adjustable height-wise. Kind of fun to be able to do that sort of thing now.
Yeah, it's amazing how, you know, for me, the fun part of AV is always finding those separate uses for things that weren't built for exactly what you wanted, or for the purpose that you've intended it for, but being able to repurpose things in that way. And I think there's a lot of cool opportunities for that. And I think, you know, just varying, you know, if everybody knows, you all know better than I do, running tech departments at universities. I mean, another thing that really leads to accessibility or student success is giving people choices of how they learn, right? Like I know in our Academy Refresh, the front seats are couches, the back seats are chairs with desks, and the you know, the back rows are standing height or stools, and we just create a lot of different choices for whoever comes in there, however they like to absorb data and learn best. That we provide a way for them to do that, and we don't make everybody sit, you know, in a standard chair with a, you know, with a rotating table in front of it, because some people may not learn very well that way. So also creating, I guess, that diversity for different neurological learning styles, you know, helps a lot too with creating accessibility. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, Mark. That was one of the points that I've been trying to push for a lot of, is moving away from the traditional, what I call the sit and stare model of sitting in the classroom and your instructor is up at the front of the room talking and the students are sitting there in a very standard, you know, everyone's in the exact same seat, everyone's facing the instructor, and they're expected to essentially be a passive recipient of that material. And they're expected, more importantly, to be in place at all times, you know, in the room at all times. And we've really moved technologically beyond that being what has to happen. We're here in the Northeast. We just had a somewhat smallish snowstorm in the Boston area, but if you went outside the Boston area, they were getting 2 feet over the course of a couple of days. And we have instructors that are coming in from, you know, out in that area. We had staff members in my department that weren't able to get in because they were out in that area. And to be able to have a class where a student doesn't necessarily have to be physically present in order to learn. We have a class that's taught here. It's part of our veterinary program. So some of the instructors are at our veterinary school, which is in Grafton, Mass, which if you know the area at all, it's a bit of a ways from here. And they got a lot of snow out there. The instructors weren't actually able to get in. It was the last class of the semester that they were holding. They had already been doing a blended format with it. The instructors were, some of them were in Grafton. It was a team teaching class. So the instructors, some of them were in Grafton the entire time. And, you know, whoever was the prime instructor that day was going to be in Medford. All of the instructors were coming from their homes that day over this link up. And more than that, majority of the students, because they're either students who are going to classes in Grafton, or even just they're in the area, they don't have a car and public transit was thrown into chaos. They were also logged in. So I think we had about 3 students on site and everybody else was remote. And that unfortunately is not the standard. We should be, as schools in general, moving towards that idea that you don't have to be physically present to take the course. You don't have to be, if for whatever reason, you could be sick that day. You could have a chronic illness that sometimes requires you not to be in class. You could be a student athlete who's traveling. You should still be able to access that education that you chose to receive. You got into the school, you're attending, you're doing the work, but you should be able to receive that education whether or not you're physically present in the room. And I just, a quick shout out, I did my master's entirely online at the University of Massachusetts. Valerie was actually one of my instructors in that program, and the entire course was done the entire program was online. And it was incredibly valuable. The University of Massachusetts Boston is in a somewhat remote location. The city is difficult to get to in the best of circumstances. And the ability to be able to dial into, just take it remotely, not have to go out there every day, for I think everyone in the program, made it significantly more valuable. And that really influenced where I kind of started going with that.
It's also possible to have blended courses where you have some of the students that are coming in through an LMS platform and then have people in the classroom. We've also used Blackboard as a back channel for accessibility and also just inclusion. We noticed our campus has a lot of very diverse students that attend there. We have students that are not comfortable asking questions of the professor in the classroom. So we use Blackboard in the face-to-face classes with staff in the chat session in Blackboard to answer questions, to move information to the professor, and sometimes to create, to add extra information, and also to bring in guest speakers and people that could not be there. We found that, as you know, it was very simple, it was straightforward, and it was extremely effective.
Yeah,
So
I remember when you're talking about this Blackboard, piece, I remember one time years ago, and I'd have to look at it again to see where I saw it, but it was a system where they actually had a room set up where you would write on this piece of glass that was kind of in front of you as a chalkboard, and the software would actually flip the content for anybody watching from before. So if I'm looking at a piece of glass and I'm writing, it's all going backwards, it would actually flip the content over in front. And it was extremely cool way to do kind of remote learning, but also have people be able to see you from where you're at as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know
yes,
it. Have you seen that before, Valerie?
I have, yes. We've also done that with Toshiba laptop,
Okay.
where we were able to use the monitor either as a writing tablet or as a monitor screen. And that's been very useful. People translating different languages we talked about earlier with Translate, or in a way of being able to take handwriting and let JAWS pick it up and read it.
Yeah.
One issue that we've been having with doing things like that for our online and blended courses is when we're trying to encourage our instructors to talk aloud while they're writing mathematical formulas and equations. And so I'm sure that other people are having that issue as well, as trying to keep those accessible to students, both in audible format, but then also when you're captioning, to try and do the mathematical scientific calculation formulations, equations are difficult.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things is too, like when Jim was talking earlier about, we think a lot about the students, but we have to think about the instructors too. I think anytime we're thinking about these solutions, we have to think about the least amount of friction for the instructor to change. You don't want the instructor to relearn how to teach right after 20 years to do something differently. You want to be able to provide tools that allow them to do what they would normally do when they come into a classroom, but still be able to provide those extra services on the back end. So the more that I can automate and reduce that friction, the better. I know at Joe's school, this was before Joe's tenure there, but I know I was out at USC 5-6 years ago, and some of the interesting things that they would do just to try to reevaluate how classrooms were set up and how they were using technology and things. At one point, they were using traffic marking cameras, and they were actually tracking, the instructor's path through a room when they were instructing in like a flipped classroom, and where should the tables be based on how many laps you had to make around to go to this group, to that group. And maybe, they would rearrange the way that they set up classrooms based on this data that they had of, how many laps people were making, or if they had to go around things, or if they come through the middle the whole time, or they walked from here to the display over and over and again. Well, why isn't the display over there? Because that's where he happens to stand when not using the display. So it was a very interesting, experiment. I don't know what all the findings were, but I know Alan, who's at USC, was telling us, what they were doing in those places. And just another way that I think you see kind of a non-traditional use of technology that was developed for something else, to be deployed in a classroom to collect some data and then be able to, you know, make the instructor's job easier as well. So
Somebody on the chat just mentioned your comment about the glass whiteboard with the reversal, image reversal. They pointed out that's called learning glass.
okay, yeah,
And I remember seeing that, and it actually it removes one of the huge design flaws with the traditional whiteboard, and that you stand at the whiteboard and you have your back to the students.
Yeah.
So our solution has been touch-enabled PC, and that's relatively new for us. We actually use Microsoft Surface Studio.
Yep.
So you have a nice large writing surface, and you can face the students and interact with them that way. We do a lot of distance ed here, so part of the job of that PC is to be able to capture handwritten notes. So we tell all of our distance learning instructors, no whiteboards. Or we can point a camera at it, it's not going to do any good. You can't use the whiteboard and teach to distant students. And that's something to get people used to.
So we have a question here in the chat, actually, for Cynthia and Valerie, about what is the most common request or concern that you get from prospective students regarding AV amenities, and I guess accommodations as well, when they are on campus visits? And as universities, are we losing students by not having a certain something that these students are looking for?
For us, it's always accessible
content.
content. Oops, sorry. It's for us, it's accessible content. Whether it's online or face-to-face, we're not delivering content in a format quickly enough. It's been an issue for a very long time with all schools. We've gone to providing materials in different kinds of format, whether it can be read on a Kindle, if it can be read in your car. We try to vary how we provide the information so we can get it to people more quickly and they have more access and time to read it.
I think we are losing students for sure. We're losing prospective students, and that is hard data to try and track. We are working with admissions, and we can kind of figure out where students have ultimately chosen to go to school if they have filled out cross apps, meaning if they choose another school over Iowa State, what was their first and second and third choice. And sometimes we can gather some data as to why that might be. And most of the time we can't gather that data. So what we are doing is we're looking for what is missing. And so for what is missing from our campus, and we are actively making our classrooms more accessible with the technology. But there's also things that we can do better. We could work more with our bus system. That's a question that we get a lot of: where and how do the buses run? The bus schedule is not produced in an accessible format. And so that's an issue for students who come to campus with disabilities. We also are in the midst of a large user experience research project that I'm leading with a team of graduate students and undergraduate students to study this of what are students expecting to see in the classroom, and how are we meeting their expectations, and how are we not meeting their expectations, and what do they need, what do they want, and then what are the instructors willing to work with us on. And so we've run into pockets of resistance here and there, but ultimately, if we can use universal design, and not only for the physical space, but for the LMS, or we're on Canvas, but Blackboard certainly does the same thing. How can we better meet those student needs? And so we're studying that right now, because we feel like we're a little bit behind in some places. We have some technology, but we need to know what to ask for, and we need data to back that up. So that's why we're doing that research.
It's interesting you say the thing about data, because that is absolutely an area where I think that we may fall down, because I don't think admissions necessarily wants to tell somebody outside admissions, because that may be in their mind or legally, I'm not sure which, confidential information that they don't necessarily want to give us, direct responses. But Joe actually was asking, will people tell you whether it's because they have bad accessibility experience? And his daughter had accessibility needs during her college tours, and those who didn't meet them immediately went to the bottom of her application list. And is that information that we're receiving? And I know that I'm not receiving that information. I don't know about you folks.
I have to hound people to get it.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting. It's funny because a lot of people don't vocalize, and I learned a long time in the restaurant business, and hotel business, that people that don't say anything are actually the ones you have to worry about the most. Right? It's the people that are vocal. At least you have some chance to meet or address their needs, even if they've now flown the coop. It's that you have the opportunity to change and better yourself for the next person that may have that same set of needs. And so sometimes you really have to have admissions tour people that are taught to inquisitively ask those type of questions, and to watch. Like, I know, for us, it was always like, if somebody said things were fine wasn't the answer that we wanted, but many times, to avoid conflict, we know something may have been wrong. We just take fine as an answer and we go on our way, as opposed to really digging in. Well, why isn't it great? Or wouldn't this be your first? Which choice is this for you? Oh, it looks, you're probably in 3 or 4 on my list. Well, why wouldn't we be at number 1 or number 2, right? Like, having those things and really trying to dig those answers out. But you're right, it can definitely be a problem. We see it all the time too, and mostly it's after the fact, right? We'll design a space, maybe we go in and we put furniture in a certain way, and then 2 months later, we're there checking on something, we notice something's been rearranged. And it's nice to ask, well, why did we rearrange that? That wasn't the way it was designed. Oh, we found out we really do this more and this less, and so we needed to reconfigure the room. And then we can take those notes and make sure we keep those in our design plans next time, right? So,
what would make your experience great as opposed to adequate, right? That's one of the questions we need to ask.
Yeah, there was I worked for a home builder too one time, called David Weekly Homes, and they're a home builder in the Southeast. They build in Florida and Texas and stuff, and they opened an office in Arizona. But one of the interesting things they did with their surveys was they went to emotional words. So, number one, they went to a 1 to 5 survey, because if people give you the next step down, you're automatically at an 80%, not a 90, right? So it hedges to actually give you lower scores, to be a 1 out of 5 instead of 1 out of 10. And the other thing is, they went away from words like completely satisfied or dissatisfied and went into words like ecstatic. So how many people could say they were happy versus ecstatic? Ecstatic is a very emotionally charged word. Not very many people are going to use that word unless the experience is really, and then it gives you a chance to address. And anybody that gave them a 3 or less on a survey, the owner of the company actually engaged with them, because they wanted to know why they weren't in the top 2 kind of categories. So it's just an interesting, I guess, side caveat of when we're talking to instructors, we're talking to students, we're talking to people, really, to not engage in a way that gives us good ratings, but to engage in a way that gives us good data, right? So.
And and there's another question here also from BC. What are some of the low-hanging fruit that our campuses can tackle to get started in this?
I know, Cynthia, you mentioned, this is something I didn't even realize until you brought up bus schedules. I mean, that seems, now that you mentioned, it seems like a no-brainer. Well, I know here on campus, they actually have an app that the students can access through a web page that shows you where the buses are at any given point. They've got GPS tracking on them. And you can open up the app and see where the bus is. So if it's snowing or raining, you could stand inside or sit inside a building close to the bus stop until you see the bus is almost there. You can go out and get to it. So, I mean, lots of simple things, it would seem like, would be able to be done without a huge amount of cost. I think a student wrote that app as a project.
Yeah, so we're checking the apps, and part of my responsibility is to see if those apps are actually accessible for students who might have use of assistive technology on their mobile device. So if they're using something like TalkBack or VoiceOver, even though it is tracking the buses, they may not be able to access that information. And so that's the part where we are challenged. And I know a lot of other campuses are challenged as well, is following the web content accessibility guidelines for the things that we are designing, the touchscreens, the kiosks, the apps, the websites. It's a huge issue for us to tackle. And some campuses are doing all of that, and that's fantastic. And I know that University of Massachusetts is doing a good job of creating accessible content. Tufts University too, and there's others out there, of course. And we're both trying to look at other universities to see where they are successful and what we can do to collaborate and share information as much as possible.
Yeah, I think as far as low hanging fruit, if you were talking about low hanging fruit out there, I mean, for me, some of the stuff that's out there that, you know, allows you to use the student's cell phone as a receiver for their headset, as opposed to having to check out an assisted listening device. There are devices out there that allow you to do that. Like you implement a transmitter in the classroom, and if they have the application, they're able to use their personal device. It's already in their pocket with their own headphones that they like, and gain access to audio. There are some devices out there that are screen sharing devices. So, you know, where just like it allows you to wirelessly share your screen to something, it actually will cast, you know, out to personal devices in the room, so that if you have 150 students in a room and they don't all have great vision and can't all sit up front, and you need to provide accessibility, again, their personal device now is becoming a receiver for that content that the professor has up on screen, and it's coming to those personal devices in the classroom as a kind of an in-classroom broadcast. Those type of devices seem really easy because we're leveraging something that students already have in their pockets that they already know how to use. And if they, like I think Cynthia was saying, you know, if they're already using some other type of accessibility app on top of their device for whatever type of disability or learning, you know, situation they're trying to overcome, that device is already prepped for that. So you don't have to do anything extra. And for me, those are typically kind of the low-hanging fruit pieces. Or how do we use what's in the pocket? You know, not what can we provide, what can we sell? You know, I'm an integrator, so a lot of people see me as the guy trying to sell people stuff. But really, for me, I mean, when I look, I'm really looking for leverage points. Where are we going to get the most use? And what do people already have that they can use that we can leverage in a space with the least amount of friction and the least amount of teaching them how to do something else anytime they come into a different space. And then also that helps with, you know, just management of things over time. You don't have to worry about sanitary concerns, about things breaking, about checking things in and out, about batteries being charged. That's all, you know, taken care of through the person that owns the device that's bringing it in the room. So
I think you're absolutely right there, Mark, too, because on a number of points, and the issue of, you know, what's in the pocket really does speak to a lot of the issue, because one area that, you know, I keep encountering is instructors who don't want to have to learn another way of, you know, adding something to their routine of setting up their class. And so if that means that they have to put on a mic because it's needed to feed into assistive listening, or if they need to, you know, set up some other accommodation within their normal setup, it can get in the way of instructors being willing to participate in what they have to do, but it can make them resentful. It can make them feel like they're being, you know, put upon to have to do that. And they do have often a very narrow time frame to get transition from walking in to getting everything set up. So the way I've been looking at it for a while now has been, one, like you said, what's in the pocket? What can we do that's pre-existing for them essentially? And two, what can we do that makes it as hands-off as possible? And I'd say that's the biggest low fruit. Streamline the process and make it so that it's not like you have to get some special access to it in order to utilize these resources. Because some people don't necessarily want to go to the disability office. They don't want to, or they don't have a diagnosis that allows them to access these things, but they would still benefit from it. Mm-hmm. And so by making the process as streamlined and open as possible, we reduce the amount of headache for the instructors, the amount of resentment from the instructors, and then also opening it up to as many students as possible who could benefit. I mean, even a 100-seat lecture hall, most people could benefit potentially from subtitles or being able to pick up the audio, you know, wherever they are in the room. Just as two quick examples.
And also, you know, Josh, I think you may have commented on this earlier on the chat, but it came up about lecture capture. I mean, this is essentially can be an accessibility tool also beyond the traditional use. I know that some of the systems, the one we're using, for example, I think will allow some of that streaming to personal devices to make it easier to see the content that's being presented. And I know that, I mean, our system has just a horrendous amount of use. I mean, we were appalled almost at how many hours were viewed on our lecture capture system. I think it was last semester, it was 7.1 million hours of content reviewed, which is just insane. I mean, and it's available to everyone. Those features are built into it. And then even students who need to go back later and review content that they may have missed during the class period can do that very easily. And then Mark, you mentioned the assisted listening that's available to your personal device. So I have on my phone, I have one of those apps, and we have some of those devices on our campus. We're looking at ways to, I will say that some of them are designed. I mean, if you've been to like an exercise facility where they have the multiple TVs across the front of the room, they use a system similar to that, where you can take your personal device and you can dial up whichever one you want to listen to while you're on an exercise bike or whatever. It's a very similar system, but they're designed to be used on not on an enterprise network, which we deal with on our campus. So we're looking at ways to make that easily accessed by students on an enterprise network, so they don't have to know what the name of the device is or the address. They could just open the app on their phone and find it. We're looking to do things like that to make that easier to use. But I will say that leveraging personal cell phone is great, and the more we can do that, the better off I think we're going to be.
Yeah, it tackles so many issues, and it tackles the learning curve, but it also tackles kind of the psychological factor of, the intimidation factor of technology, right? Like I was talking to someone who works for a company that does a lot of museum design, and they took a touch panel in to someone, and they took it in, and it was a Crestron branded, touch panel, and handed it to somebody, and they said, I don't know how to use that. Handed them an iPad with the exact same UI, no difference in size of text, resolution, pictures on the screen, 100% the same exact visual cues as to how to start a system, and they were using the system within 3 minutes because they knew how to use an iPad. So when the iPad was in their hands, it looked like something they could use. When the other thing was in their hands, they had already pre-decided that this was technology they had no clue how to use, and it didn't matter what the screen looked like at all. The psychological wall was already up. So the more that we can use that in the pocket, the more, when we're talking about resistance, like Josh was saying, the professors, they don't want to add something else to their workflow. But if you give them a way that to leverage a device they know and love, they're happy to use it. It's amazing if you ask a professor what their favorite app on their phone is, they probably have all sorts of cool stuff on there. But if you try to hand them something new in the classroom that's in a different form factor, they don't want to use it, right? So it's just one of those mental blocks that if we can get over it, it really helps people. So
it does. And Mark, I want to pick up on what you were saying about people that are using iPads in museums, and it's a known design pattern for a lot of people that are visiting. And it's when we put the content on the iPad that sometimes it can become inaccessible. So that's where we need to pay attention to not only the hardware and the specifications of ease of use of the actual device, but then also the content that we're designing as well. And so I'm a former art and design professor, and so that's really huge in my world of UX, UI, and how that intersects with universal design, and the importance of the iPad is accessible out of the box, and it's the content sometimes. And the same with LMS systems. Digital course content can become inaccessible very quickly if we're not following those web content accessibility guidelines.
Yeah, I've been teased a couple of times on Twitter because I keep posting this picture, and it's a picture of the Fisher-Price pop-up with the lion and then the elephant and then the monkey, and one you slide and one you turn a key and one you flip a switch. And I say, each one of these boxes takes a completely different action to open it, and they're infinitely discoverable by that's really, when you're talking about UI design, that's really what we want. We want anyone without any prior context to be able to pick that up, and within a couple iterations, they understand exactly what they need to do to create the action that they're trying to create. That's easier said than done, but we're even doing things like surveys with people now. Like, in audio video, we've decided that source or input are words we like to use. They're changing, like, oh, just change the source. Oh, just switch to input 2. You know, we're starting to ask people, what do you call it at home when you switch from your DVD player to your pickleball? What do you call that? I don't know. Do they call it an input? Do they call it a source? Because the vernacular they use may be different. And it might be just the difference of using that same vernacular on the same visual UI that we have, but actually giving them words that they understand that they use themselves. That makes it easy for them to do. So the nuances can be very small, but the impact can be huge.
So we have another question here, and I think this fits in perfectly with your role at UMass, Valerie, when you were working in the disability office. How do we communicate to the users that accessibility options exist? I know when we, in the class that you were teaching, you made a point of highlighting in the syllabus, where they were, what they were, and what was available. But as we go beyond that, as we make more of these things available on a wider spectrum, how do we make the end user aware that all of these accessibility options are there and are open to them, or that how to access them?
I like to do it a couple of different ways. Obviously for our students that come to the Disability Services Office. When I was working as the technology coordinator, I would do an introduction of what was available on the campus based on what the person's life circumstances were. But we didn't leave it at that. We put it in the syllabi, as you mentioned. And I always encouraged our faculty to do an introduction, if they can, before the first day of class. We're not always able to do that, but even if it is the first day of class, to go over what accessibility features are available in the actual classroom, but also what accessibility features and universal design features the faculty and their support staff have added. I like to do that partially because I want the faculty that are doing these things to get credit for what they're doing. It helps for them to get some good feedback that what they're doing is working is also wonderful. But people with disabilities, as you said, many don't even want to have to self-identify, and it gets even harder if they have to have this conversation with every single one of their professors. So to be able to have the faculty person or maybe an IT person come in and say, this is what's available, this is how you can use it, to offer learning options, I also think is a very good idea, because I work with a lot of people that don't have a specific disability, but they may have cultural norms that cross over into education here in the United States. And that's why we found the Blackboard, for instance, very useful, because we had students from Korea and different parts of Asia that were not comfortable asking questions in class. They just didn't know how to raise their hand and go for it. That's why we used the Blackboard chat client, so they could type it in there, and either the professor could look at it on his or her phone, or we have somebody else in there, as I said, that would be handling that. So part of it, what I think happens, particularly with universal design, because of the way that it grew in the United States, people tend to think it's only for people with disabilities. There's not a lot of conversation even now about this is good for everybody, for children, for people that are new to technology, for people that their life circumstances are changing, they're becoming more disabled, people that are older and are trying to figure out how to use some of this stuff. So I think that looking at diversity and looking at the cultural norms of your audience and your learning community is where I like to start. And I like to do the simplest thing that will get the biggest bang. So I start with one or two things, and then I go from there, depending on what the needs of the group are.
Valerie, another question for you. And this occurred to me when I hear you talk about working as a disability resource coordinator. How did you or would you work with the AV staff at your university? If you have a need in a classroom, or you see something that's a need like across all classrooms, how would you work with them to do that? Do they come to you and say, hey, we can do this, or do you go to them and make a request, say, we really need this?
Well, I was very fortunate that I developed a good relationship with our departments, with AV and with IT. Our disability services office had a legacy of like doing a lot of yelling. So there was a lot of like, this is not accessible and you have to fix it now. Well, nobody responded well to that. So when I started with my work, what I would do is I would go talk with the different departments. And instead of saying you're doing it wrong, I would start with what you're doing well, and I would build on that. So I think earning the trust of the people you're working with is very good. I never said they were doing something wrong or there was something missing. I would always start with, this is what's happening. This is what I have a student that is having a hard time. This is it. And instead of telling them what I think they should do, I would invite them into the conversation. So it took a while for me to get used to that, because particularly with my IT staff, they're like, okay, we'll be back to talk to you. And I'm like, hey. So in the beginning, I felt left out of the conversation, but then I really learned that that's the way that my IT staff worked. So disability services, we have our own culture. You know, instructional design has its own culture. IT has its own culture. And one of the things you need to do is learn the language of each one of the groups, because they do have their own language and their own ways of doing things. So after I earned everybody's trust, then we would sit down and discuss it. And I let them come up with the solution. They were the experts. And then I would add my part. And then we never had to, I had one nervous person who wanted to have confidentiality waivers signed. I never did that, because I knew that these people I could trust and they would keep the confidence. But there have been times when we did some very innovative things on my campus where I had 20 IT and AV people in the room. And because we were trying something that had never been done before, and people get excited by that. And then I also would give them credit. I would buy them coffee. You know, it's a lot about communication. I think most of the issues that come up have more to do with people don't understand disability. They don't understand what access means, and they're afraid to make mistakes or to feel foolish. So if you can come up with a way to avoid that, I think you've made huge inroads right there.
That's amazing. Listening to you, Valerie, I mean, to me, it sounds like, you know, there are two major things there. Like when you talked about people not wanting to re-explain probably their disability to several different professors, or, you know, that whole anchoring of, you know, the more you say it, the more you're kind of defining yourself by something, and you want to avoid that, right? You don't want to constantly think of that. And it's the power of platforming, right? There's the power of being able to implement something that's campus-wide that somebody could use. You could teach them how to use it once, and they wouldn't even maybe have to talk to a professor. They just know that that's available in every classroom on the campus, and they go in and launch the app. The other very interesting thing you mentioned that I hadn't thought about was the cultural piece, because I read a book once that was talking about cultural legacy and specifically about Korean culture, and about it being a receiver-based culture. Like in English, just like I'm going to explain to you right now, in America, we're a transmitter-based culture, meaning if you don't understand, it was poor communication on my part as a transmitter, and so I will re-explain it to you until you understand it. Whereas in those cultures, it's a receiver-based culture. They're required to receive it the right way, and if they don't receive it the right way, they're the ones who are required to ask. And it wasn't a problem on the person saying it, so it almost puts all the fault on them if they don't understand, right? So to raise their hand and say they don't understand is almost like to say, hey, I'm stupid, I didn't understand what you said to me. Whereas giving them Blackboard breaks them out of that kind of cultural legacy, which is an amazing thing. I hadn't even thought about that. So.
Yeah, I want to pick up where Valerie was talking to about just developing relationships and highlighting how important that is. Thank you for saying that, because that is important to gaining trust and to acknowledge people for their work and include them in the process. It's so important.
I know our disability resource office here used to be part of another department. And we also were, and I should mention, I'm with Classroom Services Group. We were not part of IT, though we used to be. We are now part of an academic unit that's responsible for students from incoming students all the way through graduation. Part of that was to also take on the staff of disability resources. So helping the students from inception to graduation at every step of their learning is now our entire department mission. So we actually regularly talk to our disability resource office people now, and they know the kind of stuff that we can do, and they know what to ask for, which in the past, I know they were just kind of doing their own thing and figuring out what they had to do and doing it because they weren't getting a lot of help. But definitely the communication and the teamwork is a huge part of this, I think. I want to jump back to the chat just really quick. Someone was asking, we were talking about the app-based listening systems. And they're asking, if you use an app-based listening system, does that mean you can now access from anywhere rather than just within the RF signal distance? And anyone with the app can they then listen from outside the classroom or from home or something? We've looked at ways to do this here that do not allow that. We don't think there's a real security or privacy issue here, because what we're told by our campus legal people is that a campus classroom environment is just one step above a public forum. So most of those concerns don't exist. However, we don't want a bunch of people from a bunch of different locations accessing these listening systems. We are trying to limit it through the wireless campus wireless system. So whatever access point is accessible within that classroom is the only place where that audio content's available. So that's one way to do that. We're still working on how to easily implement that and get these devices registered properly, so that's how they perform. But we're hoping that's our solution to any of those sort of concerns. And also earlier on the chat, there was a question about using Alexa in the classroom and security concerns. So we use Alexa for Business, which allows us a lot of tools like eliminating the voice history, which is available. If you have an Alexa at home, you know that you can go back and look at all the requests that were made to the Alexa and all the things that it listened to. So we can actually delete those, prevent them from being saved by using Alexa for Business. So that's a pretty handy thing to be able to do. And our last point on that is that if you have one of these in your pocket, you have a far larger security concern than you do using the Alexa device. So I digress a little bit, but I wanted to catch up on a couple of the comments that were in the chat.
Yeah, I think what, one of the other things that popped up as we were just sitting here, I was at the Audio Video Executive Conference in New Orleans in November, and they had a kind of a learning trends in learning spaces panel, and just like what Cindy was saying, the big thing right now is with multiple stakeholders in these spaces is really that team mentality, right? Like we see manufacturers talking more to technology managers at universities. We still have a service provider channel like integration that's out there. We have tech managers and their own staff. We have, all of these stakeholders in there. And I think, there's this traditional, at least from our, from an integration perspective, a lot of guys get hung up in that, like they were the traditional purveyors of information, right? And I think the more that we know that, the more that we all have information at our fingertips, and we can all leverage that in a way where we think together, it works a lot better than trying to be these silos and protecting, these little pieces of territory that we think we need to protect to keep our jobs. Because at the end of the day, we'll all have a space here one way or another. I tell my integration friends who are always worried about tech managers at universities, I'm like, where do you think they hire those from? Like that might be where you work. If everybody goes in-house, you still have a job. They have to find people somewhere. You're just not going to work for the company you work for now. And so, I think this idea of an open, flat ecosystem really helps us all as well.
I know on our campus too, and this is probably the case for a lot of people. There are a lot of different funding sources. I know in our department, building and maintaining classrooms, we have one funding pot that we deal with for the technology in the classroom. But we also work very closely with campus facilities, and the facilities people are responsible for carpet, paint, anything in the room that's considered permanent. So we're actually in a situation where our facilities campus architect and designers have worked with us to provide the funding to replace these consoles that I mentioned earlier. So we can get out take away the old huge wood and solid consoles and replace them with the height adjustable consoles and improve the accessibility of the room, which makes them happy. It also has a smaller footprint. So keeping the required spaces between the console and the wall, for example, that could be done easier. So lots of good partnerships on campus. We are not part of IT, as I mentioned, but we have a good partnership, a good working relationship with IT. And they have their own funding model as well, which is now, as I understand, is partially funded by student count and FTE. So there is a certain amount of money assigned to IT based on how many students and how many faculty staff we have on campus. And that pays for a lot of the infrastructure, pays for upgrades of switches. When we build a classroom, we install a switch that is managed and controlled by IT. We buy the switch as part of the classroom equipment, but then it becomes part of the system network and then maintained by their staff. We don't have to have our own network engineers, our own staff that are expert in that. We have people working with us that can do that.
It's interesting to me that you're talking about how you do partner with facilities a lot in terms of the work that you're doing, because that really is something that people don't think about in terms of both accessibility in the classroom, as well as where that intersects with the AV and the accessibility provided by AV in the classroom. Because we are putting in these giant teaching podiums, or used to be putting these giant teaching podiums, we're putting in equipment racks. They're knocking out space and we have to comply with ADA standards on that. And one thing that we've been doing here a lot is in rooms where we don't have space to meet that, putting the rack in, we'll mount the stuff inside the ceiling above or on top of the projector, rather than putting it at ground level, the stuff that we don't ever need to move, because we tend to be in older buildings. We can't reconfigure as easily because these are older, old New England buildings that if we start knocking out walls, we're gonna have a lot more problems than just, accessibility. So it's interesting to hear that other people are also working within the facilities constraints as well.
Oh yeah, and I mean, furniture is a big part of their mandate to provide the furniture for the classroom, and that includes everything. I mean, that's maybe height adjustable chairs for faculty to sit on. I mean, all kinds of ways that they can help us out. They're also the ones, of course, that do the electrical and the physical infrastructure updates to make all our fancy tech work in these rooms.
So another great question here too. Is there a rating system for accessibility features like there is for LEED? Or if not, is that something that we should be looking at as a standard going forward?
I'm not aware of one. I don't know if anybody else is, but I think it's a great idea.
I think what we've seen, at least working with our design folks, our architects, is that it's you're checking off a list, making sure you follow some rules, but I don't know if they have a rating that they can deal with like that. It's a good idea.
Valerie or Cindy, are you aware of there being any kind of rating system that exists at this time for how accessible something is beyond just like the ADA checklist that has to be done during room setup or class design?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know how they really could do one easily, because universal design is about approaching the needs of the group. So I don't know how we could do that in a routinized way.
There was another comment on the chat from Mike. I think he mentioned that his facilities planning and management department has someone who's very focused on ADA, which is great for them. So what they have is within their campus facilities design staff, they have an expert, which is good. I mean, I know we could all benefit from that. We kind of do stuff in the dark and hope we get it right. We do that a lot.
Yeah, and I think a partnership as opposed to a competition. I know a corporate client of mine where they're always just trying to push things into each other's budget. So if it's technology and it's in new construction, it's part of the IT AV construction budget. But if it's an existing building and it's a retrofit, then it becomes a facilities budget. So many times what they try to do is delay the rec for AV until the building is now taken possession of and is no longer a construction project, and then try to move that money into the facilities manager's bucket. So much more of a competition of who gets stuck holding the hot potato than it is a partnership to make sure that everybody's getting taken care of.
So we're starting to head into the home stretch here with this panel, and I'd just like to turn to each of you and say, do each of you have some thoughts or tips you could give for improving accessibility through universal design in the classroom or in our education spaces in general?
I'll jump in first with I had a question a while back about specifically about incorporating Alexa in the classroom. So what do we do about language, and how do we come up with a standard language in a way? And Josh, you mentioned, how do we ask for what we need? How do I ask the classroom system to do something? So we had a student developer working on our project, doing some of the coding on the Alexa side. And he's actually a French exchange student. So he had some different ways of asking for things than even we did. And which really I think was a valuable insight. And he came up with several different ways to request, like laptop. You want to show your laptop. You don't say switch to the laptop. You say, Alexa, show my laptop, or show the laptop, or even show the screen. And then at that point, Alexa will come back and ask you, okay, which screen did you want to show? And those kinds of interactions, I mean, the more we can leverage that artificial intelligence to make intelligent responses to those requests, the better off we're going to be. And for those who are interested, I actually have a YouTube video. I'm going to pop the link into the chat so you guys can look it up. So this is an instructional video that our campus people produced for our faculty and staff to actually go in and look and see how to use the Alexa. So you might find that interesting. That link's are in the chat for you guys to look at. So that's all I wanted to follow up on. Saw that a little while back in the chat history. So.
At Utah State University and can be used to control classroom equipment using.
Oops.
I'm not sure why that started to play, but it did.
It was my fault, Jim.
Oh, okay. It was not something that I did.
That's why I said oops. It was me. It was on my. I was just trying to copy and paste it into something else, but it accidentally launched. For me, since I just interrupted everybody anyway, I mean, I just go back to, leverage pocket. That's my biggest piece of advice for anybody, whether you're doing corporate or education. Anything you can do to leverage what's in the pocket becomes the easiest way to add feature sets and accessibility. And then also, think about the people. I mean, people learn differently. People like to sit differently. People like to consume content differently. Valerie said people have different cultural norms that are going to maybe make them consume or ask questions differently in the classroom. I think many times we get really caught up on the technology side, and like even what we said about the accessibility guidelines, we're checking boxes to make sure that we're not violating codes, as opposed to trying to think of ways to make things easier for people. The real thing isn't not to get an ADA fine, right? The real thing is to make sure that we're providing access to people who need it, so that they have the same opportunity to learn and grow and contribute that we do. And so never forget the people side of the technology.
Valerie or Cindy, do you have some final thoughts or some final tips on how we can improve accessibility and improve access in the classroom through universal design, and also through applying that through our technology?
One thing that I always like to start with is to make sure that the staff that I'm working with understand fully what the features of whatever technology, either hardware or software, that they're using, what it can do. So I see a lot of the time that people get excited when certain lecture capture software can caption, and they think that they're done because they can caption. But that captioning is only for people with hearing disabilities. Things change all the time with software. It used to be that some technology was fine and had great accessibility features, and then they did an upgrade and then that went away. So it's always an upward curve in my world. But I think if we can just begin with what we already have on our campuses, really check it out, talk about it in a group, figure out the creative things you can do with it. And then if you have to add more, you're in a stronger place to start, and you are in a better chance in a business model in particular to be able to justify buying something new.
Yeah, and then Mike in the chat mentioned that we have somebody on campus in our facilities planning and management who is an ADA expert and has a lot of good input on physical spaces and classrooms, and we all work together. And so that can't be emphasized enough, is just to work with people across campus. We're a bigger campus, we're decentralized, but it's really important to pull on people's areas of expertise, where I may not know all the technology, I may not know all the physical. I do know the digital accessibility standards, and somebody else posted about section, and that's absolutely true. The Rehabilitation Act, with the WCAG guidelines, to pay attention to that, which includes captioning and it includes audio descriptions. And it's an international guideline for us to follow as well.
Fantastic thoughts, obviously. And just from my perspective, the biggest thing that I would always try to reiterate is it doesn't have to cost a fortune to make things accessible. We can push forward with accessibility that is low cost, but it opens it up to so many more students, to so many more instructors being able to teach and learn in these spaces. And we don't have to break the bank to do it.
Some cases it's cheaper. Our sit-stand consoles are about half the price of our old big tank ones. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the push-button control panels are cheaper than the touch panels now too. The outdated quote-unquote ones.
Yeah, no, this is all fantastic. I just realized that I am like seriously a floating head in this video. But this conversation is just phenomenal. I know it was put here, Jody put in the chat that this is a good session for Infocom. I think this was submitted, if I'm not mistaken, already for Infocom. And so I'm sure it's not announced yet whether it will be in, but I do believe that this is, that is on the docket. And I think definitely a very important conversation, and one that we have to continue to have, especially as we actually face, and think about these. I mean, I think for many, many years in AV, we didn't take into account the needs of everybody. And I think it's great that this is coming to the forefront. I loved the conversation just about just ways, like just using our technologies as simple as an app, or what Mark was talking about, how the exact same GUI put on an iPad someone can use. Let's use these ways that people normally interact with life, and can we now bring those into the classroom and find other ways to do that, and have those conversations, and have the conversations with our ADA group and everyone. I mean, I'm speaking this, but I'm completely ignorant of it, and know I need to get educated, and that's why I absolutely loved this session. So, I guess I just want to again thank everybody and thank the panelists. Thank you, Cindy and Valerie and Mark and Josh and Jim. This was really a fantastic session.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Actually, I learned a lot too. I mean, it's good hearing from everyone else and their perspectives. Great opportunity.
Yep. And of course, I guess Josh privately, of course, he privately messaged me that yes, it was submitted. So there, it's not private anymore. And now the people from Avixa who are listening now realize that this is something you have to approve, because now you have a whole group of people watching a webinar that want this. So, so this is great. We thank you all. And just kind of now closing up for the day today, we hope you enjoyed day one of the HETMA virtual conference. Tomorrow we have 3 great sessions again, starting at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern. See, I'm gonna get those right this time. And so we obviously have the ever exciting AV as a service kicking off the morning, followed by esports, and ending up the day with the vendor relationships. So exciting day tomorrow for day 2. Again, continue to tell people we can register. So if you enjoyed it today, tell the rest of your team, tell 100 of your closest friends, and we will look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. And again, thank you to our panelists for the whole day. Have a good one.